Tonight, new political turmoil. Alabama and Tennessee are the latest states rushing to redraw congressional districts after a Supreme Court ruling that further weakened voting rights. CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian has the latest. Nicole.
6 months out from the midterms, and the redistricting wars are intensifying for control of Congress after a recent Supreme Court ruling rolled back a key part of the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court's 6-3 decision to strike down Louisiana's congressional map hits right in the heart of Cleo Field's seat.
The district was created. First of all, Louisiana's minority population, black population, is over a third of the state.
The Democrat represents the 6th congressional district, which slinks from Shreveport to Baton Rouge. But the High Court ruled the newly drawn majority-minority district was an unconstitutional gerrymander since it was based on race. Congressman Troy Carter represents the other majority-minority district in New Orleans.
It can wipe out both of our seats. We can realistically end up having 6 congressional districts with no African-American or Democratic representation.
Ahead of early voting this weekend, Louisiana officials suspended House primary elections slated for May 16th until the state can redraw its map.
I don't think that it's going to result in a loss of minority representation. And I think that we have to give the people a chance to draw their districts the way the people want to see them drawn.
Before the Supreme Court ruling, at least 7 states had already passed new congressional maps as part of mid-decade redistricting. Now, several southern states are using the High Court's decision to justify changes before the midterms, including Florida, Alabama, and Tennessee.
It was really not about, that little seat in Louisiana. It's about redistricting all over the nation. It's about the voting rights of people all over the nation.
Hello, Bobby Jones here for MeidasTouch and Valor Media Networks. Recently, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in the case of Louisiana versus Casillas that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is pretty much no longer needed. Segregation, discrimination, and anything where race has come into play in American history is no longer relevant in 2026. And therefore, districts that were drawn to have basically a majority-minority representative are, in fact, illegal. Now, as someone who was black and was born and raised in the Deep South, I almost could not believe what I was hearing, because to have supposedly the most intellectual, mature jurist on the bench at the highest levels of the United States to not acknowledge the history that is not only history that is 200 plus years in the making, but is still relevant today as far as how gerrymandering works, blows my mind. In this video, I just want to talk about the main gerrymandering that happened before gerrymandering happened for black people when it comes to voting, and how it still applies today. Let's start with the term redlining. Redlining is something that has been in America basically for 100 years. Back in 1934, in the creation of the New Deal, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a series of government spending packages that were meant to lift the impoverished and the working class out of the economic depression the United States was suffering. In that, they created the Federal Housing Authority. Federal Housing Authority was meant to basically ensure federal loans that people would go to use to buy houses. However, within that organization, the Homeowners Loan Corporation created these color-coded security maps that basically drew red lines around all the major black districts in America. Now, why does this matter? This matters because that same Federal Housing Administration that is supposed to be issuing these government loans did not issue them to anybody that lived in those neighborhoods, which, because of segregation and discrimination, were overwhelmingly black. So black people were denied the opportunity to build wealth, to build equity in their homes because of the federal government. This went into the GI Bill during World War II, where, servicemen and women were able to go to college using that GI Bill. Unless you were black or unless you were gay, they went out of their way to try to avoid you using those benefits. I say this because the reason that we have these neighborhoods, even to this day in the United States, where you have a high concentration of Black people living together, is not because Black people wanted to do it. It was because they were denied access to move anywhere else. And so when the Federal Housing Act happened in 1949, the term urban renewal comes in, and it basically demolished those Black communities and kept them in the area, and they had to fend for themselves. Meanwhile, they were not allowed the opportunity to move to the newly created suburbs, because the suburbs outside of these major cities had homeowners associations and pacts that expressly forbade Black people from buying a house in those neighborhoods. It literally said you cannot sell this property to a Negro. On top of that, the shambles that was left after World War II, where Blacks were in urban cities, the new interstate highway system ran right through every Black neighborhood and that they could. So when you look at our interstate system today, they did not go through the suburbs. They did not go through middle class neighborhoods. They went directly into Black neighborhoods and destroyed the cohesiveness and economic base of those neighborhoods on purpose. On purpose. And so the concentration of Black people that live in Memphis, Atlanta, New Orleans, I can go down this list, were there because they had no choice, and they have survived for generations despite all of these proactive efforts to break those neighborhoods apart. And so once they became a political force by basically concentrating these areas, and then Congress sees how powerful these people were voting post the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that's when new strategies came into place. The cracking and packing. Cracking meaning they break up these heavily minority districts so they don't have enough people in one district to vote for someone who's African American or Latino. And then when that doesn't work, then you pack them where there's so many of them, but you pack them as much as possible so they have one representative, vice three that they may need, or four, etc. Needless to say, the underrepresentation specifically of African Americans in Congress is seen to this day because of this practice. Now, when you go back to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to show you how powerful the oppression of the Black vote was, 3 years after LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, signed that into law, the registration for Black people to vote in Mississippi alone went from 6% to damn near 60% in 3 years. It was so successful that in 1992, you saw the height of minority representation in Congress. And then in 2006, it was the Voting Rights Act was overwhelmingly renewed 98 to nothing, because you saw the inclusivity of voting. It was obvious that all the things I had mentioned before, going back to the 30s and really back to post-Civil War, had suppressed representation of minorities. And so now, instead of making it easier to vote, we've seen since that 2006 moment, the constant erosion of the VRA from that point. Shelby County versus Eric Holder in 2013 was the real big boom heard across the legal landscape, because what it did was it struck down the coverage requirement for states that were explicitly named in the VRA to have the constant oversight and to change the formula for what constituted oversight. Basically, a lot of former Confederate states had specific things that they had to do to show that there was no discrimination or voter suppression. And the Supreme Court said you no longer have to do it. And within 24 hours, things to suppress the vote, like Texas announcing a new voter ID law, North Carolina passing more restrictions weeks afterwards, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi all did the same thing. Immediately, days after that, 5-4 vote. And as the court became more conservative based on Trump putting people in office, it just got worse. So to recap, this is not something that was just a nice to have. It was a requirement for African Americans in particular in the Deep South to vote. And by this new case of Louisiana versus Casillas being voted and decided the way it was decided, you have quickly seen Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia possibly, all trying to do redistricting on the fly in the middle of a midterm election. It is a true Confederate rising. That is not an exaggeration. That is a stone cold fact. It is literally the same states that fought against the United States in the Civil War. This is going to be fascinating to see because they're under the assumption that these new districts will remain that way moving forward. But if anything, history has shown us that political ideology shifts, and it can shift based on location. Right now, though, the Supreme Court's decision and the state houses of these deep former Confederate states have shown us that this is not about representation. This is about maintaining power at all cost.
Love this video? Support independent media and unlock exclusive content, ad-free videos, and custom emojis by becoming a paid member of our YouTube channel today. You can also gift memberships to others. Let's keep growing together.